Okay, let's do this. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Rest Show. This week, yes, we're gonna talk about Christmas. We're right on holidays coming, New Year's, Christmas is coming, and I hope you'll have a wonderful holidays to all of you, all my friends on Facebook too. And today we're gonna find out if Christmas is a pagan holiday. It was taken from some other holidays and they put all that together and say, okay, let's put all that salad together and let's bring everybody together, the pagans and everything. And that way, Rome is not going to get mad about us, the Christians, and we'll make a consensus so everybody's going to be happy. I don't think that's what happened. And first, we're going to listen to West Off. He's going to give us a little history about what really happened. And then we're going to listen to Michael Heiser, Dr. Michael Heiser, who's going to be telling us a little bit about the astrological way of seeing certain passages so we can draw a conclusion about not really when Jesus was born, but basically that not only Christmas is not pagan, but that even though Jesus is not maybe not really born on the 25th of December, we can also continue to celebrate the 25th of December. We got to find a date to celebrate Christmas, and I think basically we should just make that consensus that if they choose the 25th of December is because maybe they have a good reason to. And I'm going to give you the reason why I believe that we can still have some kind of can find some kind of parallels, or maybe we can harmonize the scriptures to make it special, even though December is not really when he was born, but maybe when Mary got pregnant. Okay, let's start with any further ado. Let's listen to Wesley Hoff and see what he has to say.
Let's start off with some of the most common accusations and objections I see. The first, and probably the most talked about, is the date of Christmas itself. It's often asserted that the date of December 25th was already a common one used in ancient Near East and Greco-Roman world. The Christians merely scheduled their celebrations of Jesus' birth on the same day as these pagan festivals to somehow make it easier for pagans or early converts to convert or start to celebrate Christmas. Apart from the fact that I wouldn't even have that big of an issue with this concept if it was true, when you really dig into the sources on what these festivals were when they happened, the argument starts to fall apart. The leading contender for this argument is the Roman festival of Sol Invictus, the festival of the unconquered sun. It's not until the middle of the 4th century that anyone makes the connection of Sol Invictus to December 25th, and earlier inscriptions are inconsistent, placing Sol Invictus throughout August, October, and early December. Christians, on the other hand, had already pinpointed December 25th as the date they thought Jesus was born, decades before any of this. I'll go into more detail in a little bit as to the reasons behind all of that, but Sextus Julius Africanus in the late 2nd and early 3rd century had already made that conclusion, and we have some early evidence that Christians were acknowledging it as such. In reality, Roman temple worship was on the decline by the 4th century, and it is just as possible and even more probable that the pagans moved their celebrations to December 25th to compete with the Christians, who were a growing religious majority at the time. In fact, Pliny the Younger in the early 2nd century had already noted, potentially a little bit hyperbolically, that the Roman temples were being forsaken due to so many Christian converts. And Emperor Julian, who was emperor for 3 years in the 4th century, grew frustrated with the lack of Roman religious devotion to idols in his time and blames the Christians specifically for this pagan crisis of faith. In his work, The Origins of the Liturgical Year, historian Thomas Taylor says this exact thing when he states that it is more likely the Roman Emperor Aurelian placed Sol Invictus on December 25th to compete with the growing rate of Christianity. Others have tried to accuse December 25th of being the date of the feast of Saturnalia, the Roman pagan festival honoring the agricultural god Saturn. However, much like Sol Invictus, our earliest sources for Saturnalia come late. Macrobius in the 5th century says that Saturnalia was celebrated 14 days before January, and keep in mind that the ancient Roman calendar at this time had 2 more days in their month of December than ours does today. This only comes out then to December 17th.
There you go.
Vermalia, although a multi-day festival in ancient Rome devoted to Saturn and Kronos, comes in as a potential candidate. But Vermalia starts in late November and ends on December 17th, right in time to celebrate the day of Saturnalia. In fact, there is no evidence that December 25th was selected to replace a pagan holiday. And other sources of deities like Tammuz, Horus, Ahura Mazda, Mithra, Attis, or Dionysus being born on or around the winter solstice, those dates come well after the 4th century, and therefore long after we know Christians had already identified Jesus' birth on December 25th and were starting to celebrate it then. In 386, John Chrysostom says that Christmas was being celebrated on December 25th and describes it as a long-time tradition. The Phalocalian calendar, produced in 354, had Christmas listed as a holiday on December 25th.
354, here you go.
The first-hand sources suggest quite strongly that Christmas being celebrated on December 25th was at least an established tradition by the early 4th century within the Christian church. The truth of the matter is that
okay,
really
let's
knows
stop right
when
there.
the birth of Jesus was.
Okay, let's stop right there. And as you notice, the Christian tradition was established way before the pagan Roman holidays were introduced in that date. So it was the other way around. That celebration of the Nativity of Christ was well established before the other pagan holidays came at that date. So this is an eye-opener, not only, I guess, for you, but for me. We're looking at history. We're not looking at just things that were made up, because we know that there were certain other historians that came later around the 17th century or 18th century that came up with the other story that was actually the Christian that came later on and kind of came in the melting pot and borrowed from the pagan traditions, and they say we're gonna do it in the same date. It's the other way around. Very eye-opener. Now we're gonna be listening to Michael Heiser about the astrological way of seeing when exactly was Jesus born, and how we can come to that conclusion. And I'm going to tell you my take how we can come to that conclusion too. Okay, so let's listen to Michael Heiser on the date of the deity of Christ. Okay?
So this celestial object in Matthew 2, the Star of Bethlehem, whatever that was, and its behavior, its movement, if you're just looking at Matthew 2, you don't have the context for understanding what that is. In other words, you can't, if you weren't a magi, one of the magi, and you saw that thing in the sky, you wouldn't think anything of it because you lack sort of the astronomical, the wider context. You don't really know exactly what you're looking at. You can see something, in the sky. You can see it maybe, change directions if you went off and did something, came back a few minutes later, a few hours later. You can do that. But you don't have the astronomical context because this isn't what you do. You're a shepherd or you're something else. Well, the Magi understood the bigger picture. They could single out this object and understand what it was meaning because they knew the wider context. And so as we transition, to what this context was, the question is there anything in the New Testament that might give us that context, that might give the star of Matthew 2 the context that the Magi had, that would inform, an ancient sky watcher that this particular object that's mentioned in Matthew 2 marked the birth of a divine king? And there is indeed. There is a context for that in the New Testament. It's found in a passage that few New Testament scholars associate with the birth of Jesus, which is ironic, especially since this passage says what it says in conjunction with the birth of the Messiah. And you're going to say, well, that sounds kind of insane. How do people miss it? Well, they miss it because, for a number of reasons, but since it's in the last book of the New Testament, and that isn't part of the birth narrative in the Gospels, people don't make the connection.
Yeah.
But the connections are there if you just read the text for what it actually says. In other words,
what it says.
if you let the text say what it says. And sometimes, believe it or not, the text just means what it says. So Revelation 12 is the passage I'm talking about, specifically the first 7 verses or so. And again, I'm going to be quoting a lot from my book here and some sources I use in the book, and I will telegraph those when I get to that point. There are going to be a few that I especially touch base with. Martin's book, The Star That Astonished the World, which is available free online, by the way, and also Beale's commentary, his massive commentary on Revelation. Now, an important note here before I read Revelation 12. None of what I say, or frankly of what Martin said, should be construed as Old Testament messianic prophecy. What Revelation 12 describes in terms of astronomy, reading it as an example of astral prophecy, what Revelation 12 describes in terms of astronomy was not prophesied in the Old Testament anywhere. Revelation 12 does not quote the Old Testament when it comes to the messianic birth in the context of the celestial imagery that it gives. In other words, the signs here in Revelation 12 are not part of the Old Testament messianic prophetic complex. What we have in Revelation 12 is, I think, a record of what the Magi saw in a wider lens that was codified by John well after the birth of Jesus. So John would have to have had a source. That source is ultimately unknown. I'd guess that he got his material, which would involve dates and events from Jesus' early childhood, at least from eyewitnesses to the Magi visit, and perhaps a few details from Mary. I mean, we don't know where John got his source, but we know he had to get it somewhere because he wasn't present there, and he wasn't one of the Magi. Now, it's unreasonable to presume, in my view, that John concocted the material after the fact, even though Revelation 12 was written well after the birth. And I think that for a couple of simple reasons. Number one, the date produced by reading Revelation 12 the way we're going to read it coincides perfectly with important calendrical items that are part of Jewish messianic expectation. And number two, the date produced is quite workable. I would say completely workable in the context of the entirety of the rest of New Testament chronology. So in other words, you couldn't arbitrarily pick a day, time, and year, or arbitrarily pick something going on in the heavens that happened not when you're writing, but at some other point. You couldn't arbitrarily, unintelligently pick something like that and get lucky. That the scene you're picking in the sky, you're making this up, after the fact, just to write something about Jesus that is going to, mystify readers and draw attention to his birth. You can't just pick that and get lucky that the thing you picked works everywhere else chronologically and calendrically in terms of events of Jesus' life. Not only that, but all the other events of the New Testament. Because this date that Revelation 12 produces does that. It works. It fits in with everything else. So I think it's a real stretch to say, oh, John just got real lucky. Just a highly intelligent guess. No, I think he had a source for this. And what he writes in Revelation 12 becomes, again, part of that book and it harkens back to what's going on. So I can't really prove that this is what the Magi saw, but I think it makes a lot of sense if this is indeed what the Magi saw, because the best explanation for the star, the celestial object of Matthew 2, is going to be part of the celestial setting that we get when we read Revelation 12. So it gives it a context. So here we go. Now, here's Revelation 12. It reads as follows. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads, 7 diadems. Verse 4, his tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she, whose tutelage, the Romans thought, had brought Rome to greatness and world rule. If it co-opted a Christian celebration, so much the better, because he hated Christians. Significance in the Roman pagan festival calendar before Aurelian's time, nor did the cult of the sun play a prominent role in Rome. It was a paganization of Christianity that the church just, how his name's pronounced, but the author here names these 2 scholars. One is Jablonski, who was a German Protestant. The other was a Catholic, Dom Jean Hardouin, and I'm probably butchering that French name as well. He was a Benedictine monk. And their work on December 25th is really what's at the heart. Here we go again with 18th, 19th century scholarship that is at the center of so much of what goes on in internet theology. Ty or Teague, again, I'm going to try not to keep mentioning how I don't know how his name's pronounced, but the author here names these 2 scholars. One is Jablonski, who was a German Protestant. The other was a Catholic, Dom Jean Hardouin, and I'm probably butchering that French name as well. He was a Benedictine monk.